It is Tuesday morning and getting ready to head out to Levi Stadium to see the 49ers. If you are watching this on YouTube, there will be more after 49ers practice. Niners are going to practice today, and then Kyle Shanahan's going to talk afterwards. So should be some interesting stuff that comes out of that. If you are watching on YouTube, hey, great. A lot of you watch Sunday's show with Josh Dubow and John Dickinson. Thank you for watching that. It was good. If you missed it, people seem to enjoy it. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Appreciate that very much. Podcast listeners, leave a question in an Apple Podcast review. 5 stars, leave a question. And I've been pushing the mailbag. We are getting to them. We are getting close to mailbag time. So we'll get to that once we do. You'll know. I wanted to weigh in on Brandon Aiyuk. There's been so much talk about Aiyuk. I thought about waiting until later today, but I wanted to do it now because I saw something that Mike Garafolo said on NFL Network. Mike Garafolo said this on NFL Network on Monday afternoon, evening. I think the insiders, the NFL Network has moved their schedule around. Hard to tell exactly when's what. I like that show, but they're doing less live programming on NFL Network, which is interesting. Anyway, here is what Mike Garafolo said, and I want to react to several parts of this because, you know, the way it's being discussed is like the Niners and Brandon Aiyuk are on this collision course. Something has to happen. Voluntary OTAs going on right now. Where is he? What's going to happen in a month? Mandatory OTAs, a trade, right? So here is Mike Garafolo on Aiyuk, and then I want to go through it piece by piece.
Them as well, and the Niners on the other.
All right, let me start this. Here we go from the beginning.
Well, we know about Brandon Aiyuk and his situation with the San Francisco 49ers because it's been a topic of discussion and was around the draft. Would the Niners trade Brandon Aiyuk? And the teams that checked in on it got the sense that no, they weren't interested in doing it. That's what they said as well. So now it's back to the table to try to get a contract extension done. And it doesn't seem like they're any closer at this point, Tom, than they have been over the last couple of weeks and months here. So don't expect to see Aiyuk around for anything that's voluntary. And let's see about the mandatory stuff as well with him, because you know he wants this done. He doesn't want to have to play on the last year of his contract. And if the 49ers at some point realize, well, we can't get this thing done, does he push their hand and say, well, look, either it's a contract or get me out of here? We're not there. There hasn't been a trade request. I know that there were rumblings and reports about it. We're just not there at this point. It's just a matter of figuring out what his value is, because he's looking out and he's seeing the deal that Amon-Ra St. Brown got done, and the 49ers may turn around and say, well, your production is not the same as his, and he could say, well, my target share is not the same. Between Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, the ball's got to go elsewhere in this offense. So if I had the number of targets that he had or some of these other guys had, my production would be up there with them as well. And the Niners, on the other hand, are saying, well, we've got to pay all these other people. How can we possibly pay you at the top of the market as well? So that's the dance that's kind of going on right now. But every sense that I've gotten from speaking to folks familiar with the progress of talks is that, Tom, they are not close at this point.
Okay, not close. And maybe you've heard somebody talk about this already. I'm not too interested for this discussion in whether they're close or not close. What interests me about Brandon Aiyuk is how it ends, because there are no stakes right now. It's May. Voluntary minicamp means you don't get fined for not being there. There's literally no punishment, right? Financial punishment. Even you get to mandatory minicamp, there is a hefty punishment. You get to the season, there's a hefty. You get to the real preseason, there's a hefty punishment. But right now, there are no stakes. STAKES. There are a lot of stakes in my freezer, STEAKS, thanks to butcherbox.com/ham. But there's no stakes here with Brandon Aiyuk and the 49ers. For those of you who've been listening or watching for the last several months, you know that my first opinion on this, and your first opinion isn't necessarily your last opinion, but my first opinion on this subject was that people need to really understand why it'd be beneficial for the 49ers, beyond the obvious reasons, to have Aiyuk play on his 5th-year option. I think if they could play it out the way they want to play it out, he would play. They'd have him play on his 5th-year option. And the reason for that is, the reason I don't think it's extension or trade, is that he has no leverage, right? Garafolo says in that clip, you know he wants this done. He doesn't want to play in the last year of his contract. Okay. Yep, definitely. And then he says something to the effect of, at some point, will it become either get a contract or get me out of here? Well, get me out of here is a very ineffective strategy for Brandon Aiyuk. And the reason is that there's nothing that will incentivize the Niners to get him out of here, quote unquote, because the draft is gone, right? Get me out of here. Okay, maybe we can trade you for a first. Well, that didn't happen. So get me out of here. We don't really want you out of here. Well, get me out of here. I'm going to hold out. Are you though? Are you really? You're going to miss games? Are you really going to do that? No. So, I just don't see the urgency. Well, I do see the urgency. Later, I see the potential for urgency. I think it's going to be really hard for Aiyuk to put pressure on the 49ers. My belief on this is they want him back. But the beauty for them, if they could find a way to not pay him yet, I don't think the issue is that the Niners don't want to pay Brandon Aiyuk. I mean, nobody wants to pay some of these top of the end salaries. I think they want to pay him later. Here's the assumption that everybody who talks about this seems to be going off of, and people who don't talk about this. The assumption is that Deebo Samuel's about to play his last year for the 49ers, right? I think that's been discussed so much that people talk about it as if it's fact. As you know, I have more Deebo stock than most in my portfolio. That wasn't the case 6 months ago necessarily, but I've bought more lately because everybody seems to be selling. And I think part of the strategy here might be, if we can wait a year to pay Aiyuk, then we can wait a year to move on from Deebo, right? Deebo gets cheaper, right? Deebo gets cheaper next year. Deebo gets cheaper in a couple months here this year to cut or trade, right? But Aiyuk, the later you sign him, the more you can push back his big money. And so for the Niners, the benefit of signing him next year instead of this year is you get to push the big money back. And I know people think that's a bad thing because you're potentially signing Brock Purdy next year. And if you sign Purdy and Aiyuk at the same time, now their big money years are going to run into each other. But it's going to be hard to avoid having big money years run into each other if you're going to pay a contract of a quarterback north of 50 million or north of $50 million a year. So it's going to be tough to avoid. From my perspective, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at how long can you keep Deebo, Aiyuk together. And if you wait a year to do the Aiyuk deal, then you can keep them together longer. Now, the counter to that point is, hey, great on paper. We're talking about human beings. You want Brandon Aiyuk to just be a good soldier and you tell him we promise in 12 months, then we're really going to pay you. And it's also we can keep this championship window open. Easier said than done. But I do think that is part of this, is the Niners have the leverage. Now, if you go back to the original time we talked about this, or, the first weeks we talked about it, I gave some percentages on what I thought the most likely scenario was. I thought the most likely scenario was that the Niners and Brandon Aiyuk would not get a contract done, but he'd play this year on his fifth-year option, and they'd get a contract done next year. I thought the second most likely scenario was they extend him, and I thought the third, by a long distance, third option is that they would trade him. They didn't trade him by the draft, so it makes no sense to do that now, because you're not getting a first-round pick. We know that. You're not getting a 20, and you can't use that pick until later, and you got a Super Bowl window, and your quarterback loves this guy and throws to him all the time, and blah, 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 blah. Brock Purdy becomes less valuable the second Brandon Aiyuk is not on your team anymore. So for all, those are obvious considerations. Now, as time has gone on, John Lynch has talked, Aiyuk has spoken, and every indication is that they really are trying to get a contract done. And so my percentages have changed a little less fifth-year option and a little more get a contract done. But I still on paper. But this is a real football team with human beings. It's not played on paper. You got to think about, how this guy's going to perform if he's unhappy. It's not so much that you're afraid that he's not going to show up for games. You're afraid that he just won't show up in the way you need him to show up. Now, that said, I don't think that's going to happen for Aiyuk. Like, if you play this out and Brandon Aiyuk plays on his fifth-year option, I think you'd get a player out for blood. And some people will think, well, he's out for blood because he's never coming back. He's playing for that big contract from somebody else. If that's a mindset, that's a mindset, but it's really not the reality of where the leverage sits. At the end of the day, they can just offer him money next year. They could offer him market money next year with the threat of the franchise tag, which, just like he's not going to hold out, they're probably not going to use the franchise tag, but you could use that as the leverage. So I think this ends, first of all, this year with him playing on the team. I'm not 100% convinced it ends with him getting a contract extension. This does not end with a trade, I don't believe. And I still think it's a possibility that he plays on the 5th-year option. Won't like it. In the end, we'll get paid. But I do think the 49ers have an incentive here to pay him because they want to make him happy, because if they believe in him as much as I think they believe in him, they don't want to have a year of unhappy Brandon Aiyuk, because for them, it's going to pencil to play him on the 5th-year option. They know they're dealing with human beings. They have a lot of people, Kyle and John, they understand the human being. John Lynch is very in tune with the human being side of this. And Brandon has an incentive to wait also. He'd love to get the biggest wide receiver contract right now today, but there are other high-profile receivers who are going to be ahead of him in the hierarchy of wide receiver contracts, like Justin Jefferson, that he's waiting on. So all of that is to say what I said at the beginning. There are no stakes now. There's no reason right now to do this unless the Niners are going to go all the way to the top of the market, which is not what they do. That's not how they operate. And so take a breath. That's not me saying just chill, everything's going to work out. I think it will, but it is. I'm not exactly sure how yet, and the mechanics of all of that is going to be interesting. So that's where I'm at on it. That's the update on that. Camp later today. Again, if you're watching live, keep an eye out for that. And we'll see which of the predictions here were right. I know if he plays on the 5th-year option, then I'll bang my chest, because that's what I said from the beginning. But I think that gets less likely, and the contract extension remains very likely, and the trade remains not likely at all. Okay, thanks for that quick chat, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Later.